Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our adult education session. Welcome to folks watching online or watching the video after the fact. Glad you're here. Plenty of seats available here in the front if you need that as well. We're continuing along in our series, Thinking Critically, Living Biblically, Attending to Scripture in a Complex Modern World. The titles keep getting longer. And what is this, our fourth session, I believe. So maybe fifth. Good to have you here. Another tough topic today, Conquest and Colonization. We'll get those solved in about an hour and be ready to move on to the next thing for sure. A couple of quick announcements as we settle in. One is typically we've used adhesive name tags here. We're trying to move away from that for a number of reasons. One is getting away from single-use things. Another good reason is permanent name tags, which have not been much of a thing during my time here at Westminster, but they are now. So if you want to be doing what the cool kids are doing, we recommend getting a lanyard. At the back table, there's several lanyards with inserts. There are a couple of Sharpies. You can make your own. You can do whatever you want. You can decorate yours. You can bring it home and do something really nice, laser print something. Whatever you want to do, we just ask that you would bring it and wear it more frequently. This is super helpful for me, somebody who's not usually good with names, and good for the entire community in a large church. It's good to find ways to meet people without feeling the embarrassment of, my goodness, I've sat with this person for 5 Sundays. I don't know their name. It's now too late. I used to work with somebody at Luther Seminary who called me Mark so often, I just stopped correcting him. And then you get to a point where it's just embarrassing after a while, right? And so I just would answer to Mark all the time. We don't want that to happen to us. So as a gesture of goodwill to one another, of hospitality, whether you're new here or been coming here a long time, please make a permanent name tag and wear that. Other quick announcement is I started last Monday a series on Monday nights by Zoom. We've got, over 60 people signed up. And we're talking about the Bible 101 and doing just really some basic questions about what the Bible is. How is it organized was last week's theme. Where did it come from is this week's theme. Eventually we'll get to how do you read it better. So if you missed last Monday's session, it's not too late. You can join tomorrow on Zoom, 7 to 8. But to sign up and to get the Zoom link for your device, you need to sign up on Realm. So if you do that today, that would be great. Question in the back.
Yes, I tried to do that, and Realm said registration closed.
Uh-oh. I will fix that today. I appreciate that. I appreciate that more than you know. If you didn't hear, somebody said thank you, Mark, so that's great. All right. I'll have that fixed by 1 o'clock today, so apologies for that. Anything else? Those are the announcements. Excellent. So again, today's topic, Conquest and Colonization. You're probably wondering, why all the difficult topics? Last week, I talked about enslavement and race. Prior to that, Margaret talked about law and also talked quite a bit about the book of Exodus and the power of a narrative about liberation, but also being a narrative very much about violence and has very clear-cut, heroes and enemies, the good folks and the bad folks, and the complexity of narratives like that. Sometimes the biblical narratives seem kind of morally flat or a little bit simplistic. So how do we read through those? We're not starting with difficult topics just to bum everybody out. We're trying to illustrate the ways in which the Bible is a very powerful book and demands that we read it. And this is language Presbyterians often use around ordinations and installations. Vince walked in at the perfect time with what? Energy, intelligence, imagination, and love, right? Language we like to use about effective ways of reading Scripture together, of being in community together, of doing theology together. We need all 4 of those things: energy, intelligence, imagination, and love. The Bible doesn't just spit out an answer to whatever problem you type in on the front end. We have to read these books together. My goal is not to send you home with clear, easy answers. In some ways, it's to complexify some things. And to acknowledge, too, that we're talking about some topics that really demand a lot of attention. We could spend a whole semester on conquest and colonization if we had time. Giving it only 1 hour is, I admit, a little simplistic and kind of flattens the work, but hopefully it's provoking us to think. And in weeks ahead, we're going to talk more generatively as well. We're not just going to talk about, here are some texts the church has done some terrible things with, or that the rulers of this world have done some awful things with, but we want to talk as well about the ways in which the Bible has inspired us to love and to good deeds throughout history. I want to acknowledge, too, that the themes lately, they hurt. I mean, last week just wasn't fun to teach, wasn't fun to see your faces as we were talking about the history of enslavement and some of the ways that's been racialized due to biblical texts. Some of that will happen today as well, just to acknowledge that, right? It's hard to look at the ways in which your folks, right, the church as a whole has made mistakes. That's not the whole of our history. There's a lot of heroism and love and again, good deeds in the history of the church. And we'll get to some of those as well. But I just want to acknowledge that if these seem difficult, then you're doing it right? And one of the questions is, well, how do we live faithfully in light of some of these stories that have a shadow side to them as well? All right, one more thing by way of introduction. In some of what I'm going to say today, I'm leaning somewhat heavily on a single article, not because it's brilliant or says things the only correct way, but because it just lays out some of the issues very, very sensibly. And it's by an Old Testament professor at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio, Daniel Hawk. And the title of it is The Myth of the Emptied Land, Biblical Conquest and American Nationalism. And if you snap a photo of this with your phone and search for it later today, you can pull up the entire article. It's not super technical, but it is a slow read, maybe about 15, 18 pages, if I remember correctly, where he's, I think, very effective and goes into detail that I don't have time for, is to talk about ways in which we might see parallels between how the Bible talks about the conquest of the so-called Holy Land and similarities with the American westward expansion and what that has meant for indigenous peoples as well. Not just to be indigenous folks who need to be pacified, but literally to be exterminated in the views of some people, and how that crept into American policy, and how there was a kind of ideological or a theological even bias behind that, and sees some interesting parallels between the way in which the book of Joshua in the Old Testament talks and the way in which especially some 19th century American thought leaders and politicians talked as well, even prior to the 19th century. So just to note that. That's all by way of introduction. To talk about conquest, colonialism, I want to talk about land, first of all, as an important theme throughout the Bible, and just give a bit of a very, very rough 50,000-foot overview of how land functions in a lot of the ways in which the Bible talks theologically. Most of this applies to the Older Testament. But here we can talk about creation, of course. I'm skipping over the creation narrative. But the promise to Abraham in the book of Genesis, 12th chapter of Genesis, right? Still very early on in the Bible, you get God appearing to Abraham and making promises to him. And one of those promises is about land. Here's where we can drop into the story in Genesis 12. This is before he's known as Abraham. His original name is Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your father's country and your kindred and your father's house." He's living in kind of what's today southeastern Turkey. Go from there to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There's at least three elements to the blessing here, or to the promise. One is land, right, an actual physical place to dwell. One is progeny or offspring, family. I will make of you this great nation. And the third one is that you will somehow be the source of a blessing. These same three promises get reiterated in multiple places in Genesis, and they get referred to in a lot of places in the Older Testament. This promise of a homeland, right? This promise of becoming a nation yourself, that's great. and that somehow through that nation, blessings will flow to the rest of the world. In a lot of ways, the Older Testament is a story about the failure of all of that to materialize, right? The ways in which the nation struggles over and over again and is criticized for not being such a blessing to its own people and also to its neighbors. But a lot of the Old Testament figures, the writers, continue to push forward this vision, right, of one day God will bless this people, and that will be a means by which the entire world experiences divine blessing. The Newer Testament comes back to this, talks about Abraham quite frequently, in fact, and Paul in particular sees that promise being fulfilled in an unexpected way through Jesus Christ, that somehow through Jesus now you've got the Messiah to Israel, a Jewish Messiah, through whom the Holy Spirit flows and everybody is welcome into God's salvation. You see how the Newer Testament in some ways fulfills that promise or sees that promise being fulfilled largely through the idea of a blessing to the nations, much less so biologically or genealogically, and much less so regarding land. Does that make sense? Like there is no Christian homeland, so to speak, in the Newer Testament. More on that in just a minute. So you've got this at the beginning, this idea of Abraham as a faithful, obedient person who's willing to leave the security of his father's clan and to become a nomad or to continue living a nomadic existence until the time at which God might finally fulfill these promises. You've also got in a number of writings, largely through Torah, through the law, and through some of the prophets, this notion that the land on which this nation will finally dwell, that the health of the nation and the health of the land have this kind of symbiotic relationship. Maybe not quite in the way we would think about this today with an ecological mindset, but similar in some ways, right? There's not this notion of the land being this passive spot in which you dwell, right? But there's this interaction with the land. So a couple of examples of what I mean by this. In Isaiah, one of the prophets, he says, "The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant." In other words, when you sin, when you turn away from God, even the land itself suffers in some way. The book of Numbers, this is in the Torah, "You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land." Here it's talking about violence and murder in particular. "You shall not defile the land in which you live, in which I also dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites." In other words, God's saying, I'm here too, right? Don't think you can get away with killing one another without defiling the place, where God chooses to be present among you. Jeremiah, one of the prophets, "You have polluted the land with your prostitutions and wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld and the spring rain has not come." Now again, this is poetry. This is not God saying every time there's a famine or there's a drought that it's somebody's fault in particular. I grew up in California. Whenever there was an earthquake, somebody nationally would say, God's judging, the people of the West Coast again. They never said that when there was like a tornado in rural Mississippi or anything like that. But we in California, when I was a kid at least, we kind of felt a little picked on. The book of Hosea, "There is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Therefore the land mourns and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing." Again, this sounds really different in our time of climate collapse, doesn't it? And what we know about our effect on the environment. I'm not sure that the Old Testament authors meant it in exactly that way, but there is still this interesting connection, right? Our health is bound up in the health of the place where we dwell. So that's another biblical theme that's swirling around here as the Bible talks about land. In other words, if you want to preserve this land as a good thing, follow the Lord, right? Don't turn away. That theme is there throughout Scripture. The conquest narratives, the books of Joshua and Judges. I checked my notes. I taught on those two books exactly 2 years ago. I'm sure you all remember it really, really well. I'll come back to this in just a moment. We'll spend a little bit more time with Joshua and Judges. Let me just quickly note here, you've got two books that describe the liberated slaves coming out of Egypt. They've wandered in the wilderness. Now they finally are taking possession of this land that God has promised them for the first time. And the book of Joshua describes a very violent, very swift invasion and takeover, while the book of Judges describes a more ordinary coexistence. You've got these right next to each other. You might think that's weird. Well, yeah. Genesis 1 and 2 has two creation stories that don't line up, that are right there next to each other, something similar perhaps with Joshua and Judges. We might point out too that neither Jesus nor Paul mention Joshua at all in the Newer Testament. Joshua is not a figure who gets a lot of attention in the Newer Testament writings. Again, more on that in a moment. The fall of the northern and southern kingdoms, a big part of the biblical history about the rise of these kings, and and then the nation divides. There's a northern kingdom, there's a southern kingdom, and both of them are overrun by empires. The Assyrian Empire in the north, the Babylonian Empire takes over the southern kingdom. People are scattered, people are sent into exile. There's a sense of a loss of national autonomy, a loss of identity, a loss of land. And the worry is, does this mean a loss of God's blessing? And so a lot of the writers who write around this time are saying, God has not given up on you, but basically you shouldn't have been so sinful and then this wouldn't have happened to you. It's not, we talked about this a lot 2 years ago. Maybe not a theology we would want to pick up and drop into our own times or endorse all of the time. But there is this deep concern about the way in which the loss of the nation was a result of faithlessness to God. You've got people who write about the return from exile and talk about the future of life in the land. And you've also got in the Older Testament a time, this is now roughly 300 years prior to Jesus, that whole period where you've got a variety of foreign empires, foreign kingdoms that hold sway over the land we now call Israel, in Palestine, I'm just going to refer to it as the land, assuming that you know. And there's deep concern, right, about how can we live here when there are these foreign elements literally ruling among us. The New Testament takes place with that area entirely occupied by Roman authority. When I say occupied by, I don't mean there's a Roman centurion on every single street corner, right? But it's a Roman property. Right? Taxes come into Rome. I see more folks are arriving. If you want, there's lots of room up front. You can come in the side door. Nobody will. They're starved for company at the front table here. But for the most part, in the Newer Testament, land is not a big deal. One place to get a sense of this is at the very beginning of the book of Acts. Jesus has risen from the dead. He's hanging out with his followers prior to his ascension. And just before he leaves them, they ask him, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus doesn't really give an answer to the question. What he says is, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons that God has set by God's own authority. And then he goes, bye, and leaves. Not quite that quick, but close to it. In other words, he doesn't answer the question, just kind of says it's not for you to know such things. So it's interesting. You can imagine his followers, who are all Jewish, right, who are thinking, we believe you're the Messiah. We kind of thought that would mean driving out the Gentiles, which means the Romans. We kind of thought you would be ushering in this new era of righteousness. We love the death and resurrection thing. That was great. But, what's next? And he doesn't give them a clear answer, right? He doesn't make this promise. You have other passages that promise a kingdom or a reign or a realm in which God will now have God's way with the world, and those promises are usually pretty good, pretty sunny. But Jesus commissions the church without really knowing what that future will look like. And we don't get really anywhere in the Newer Testament a promise of one day you will have land. In other words, that Abrahamic promise of land kind of gets spiritualized in the Newer Testament. And by that I mean the homeland is the church itself, right? The homeland is where you dwell, and that church is dispersed. It's spread out. It doesn't need a centralized temple. The book of Revelation at the very end of the Newer Testament promises a new city, a new Jerusalem, and it says there will be no temple in that city, for God will dwell among God's people. In other words, you don't need to go to a special place to encounter the holy, to encounter the divine. God will be everywhere. So the New Testament's imagination, it's not that there's a special land or a special nation. It's just wherever you are, there God is. Does that make sense? There's a kind of diffusion of that promise there. One of the things that in some ways separates contemporary Christianity from contemporary Judaism, right? Again, not all Jews are expecting a homeland. That would take about 4, 5, 8 Sundays to go through all of that, right? There's no one way of being Jewish, just like there's no one way of being Christian. So before you ask me, what's the Jewish take on the Holy Land today, I'm going to say to you, depends which Jewish take you're looking for, right? That's like asking Christians, what do Christians believe about I don't know, capital punishment or something like that, right? All over the map. Anyway, so that's just kind of, again, a very high-flying overview of some of the ways in which land is talked about and the importance of dwelling in the land, or the importance of God being known and known to you wherever you might dwell. I promised I'd go back to the Conquest. This is, again, the part of the Older Testament that talks about the time in which these liberated, enslaved folks from Egypt have wandered, and now they're going to take the place that God has promised way back when Abraham was a figure in the book of Genesis. We're talking hundreds of years post-Abraham now. And when we get to this part of the Older Testament, there's really two books that describe how it takes place. One is the book of Joshua, one of the most violent books, if not the most violent book in the entire Bible, which describes a very swift conquest. It tells God saying, I'm going to fight for you, don't worry about it. The armies prevail. There are frequent reminders to wipe out each and every last person. Right? It's, again, very, very violent. There are warnings. If you don't drive out all of the inhabitants of the land, you're going to pay for it in the end. And roughly the first half of Joshua describes an invasion that just happens like wildfire and is very, very effective. The second half of the book of Joshua is largely about partitioning, right? It's an urban planner's dream. It's all about these tribes get this land, these tribes get, it's not the most exciting part of the Bible, but it's this idea of we possess the land now, how do we allot it amongst ourselves? You flip over the page then to the book of Judges, and you just see what seems to be much more like a gradual settlement. There's frequent references to other people who live alongside the Hebrews who were not driven out of the land, and sometimes there's skirmishes, but for the most part, there seems to be this coexistence. So it raises this question, like, what really happened historically? One of the things that we know is that some of the places described by the book of Joshua, it doesn't appear that it happened the way in which Joshua describes it happening. So here are the walls of Jericho. This is not how they really look. Archaeologists had to put them back together for the photos and things like that. But where the ancient city of Jericho was, from our best archaeological work suggests that they collapsed on themselves or were somehow otherwise destroyed around the year 1550 BCE, before the Common Era, which is about 400 years before the time that Joshua narrates. In other words, it appears that some of these big cities that Joshua describes the Hebrews taking down were already in ruins. And the land was not very well inhabited, or not very densely inhabited. It was largely nomadic groups that were living there. So that creates some really interesting questions, right? So there's a number of theories. Was this really an invasion, taking over land and driving out people who already possessed it? Or was this more of kind of various groups living within the land, vying for power, sometimes some rising in prominence, but otherwise living together, each with their own religious systems, their own laws, their own clan connections? Which is it? We're really not entirely sure, but the latter one seems more likely, again, given the archaeological record. There's just not that kind of physical evidence, at least, for this kind of massive invasion. Well, that raises, of course, a number of questions, right? If the story that's told in Joshua about a violent conquest, if that indeed is fiction, right? If it's a kind of foundation myth that people told to describe their origins, where in the world did it come from, right? Raises a number of questions. What was the story trying to promote? Why tell a story like that in the first place, right? And how has the story been used throughout history as well? At least those are the two questions that interest me today. There's a number of other questions. Does that make sense in general? I didn't put our really weird timeline up here that Margaret and I have used from time to time. The book of Joshua purports to describe things that happened roughly 1,100, 1,200 years before Jesus, and they were probably written down somewhere about 500 years before Jesus. In other words, a good 500 to 700 years have elapsed between the history that Joshua purports to tell and when it was actually written down. And when Joshua was written down, appears to be a time when, later on, the nation is in exile. It had suffered its own humiliating defeat at the hands of the Babylonians, and people are trying to figure out what went wrong. Right? What did we do wrong? Where is God? Why has this national embarrassment happened to us? And one of the answers to that is to tell the story of the origins of the nation in a very violent way. Not the only way. The author or the collector of the book of Judges tells it a different way. We have our own national myths. We have our own foundational myths, right? Some of those are very sanitized. Some of those are very violent. Some of those are very one-sided, right? We tell our history in a number of ways. In some ways, the book of Joshua kind of describes that on steroids. So important to kind of reckon with these questions, right? What was the book of Joshua trying to do? I should point out, too, these are both very kind of handle with care books, right? I mentioned the book of Joshua being probably the most violent book in the Bible. The book of Judges has a lot of violence as well and is kind of a depressing book and is a weird book. Don't build a theology based on either one of those alone, right? Talk to me if you feel tempted to do that, right? And when we treat them as more kind of a mythological understanding of the birth of the nation, right, and the struggles of the nation, what do we learn from that? Not to excuse them entirely. They're still, Joshua at least, a very violent book, but to kind of recognize where they come from. We all in the same place. Do we have a microphone to run? You're up, Doris. Doris is on her way. Sorry to wake you.
Does the Bible spend any time wrestling with the dichotomy of, like, hey, I know we just told you this, but here in Judges, we're going to tell you that? Like, is there any passages acknowledging...
Yeah, kind of a back and forth.
Yeah, the difference between?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of. I can't think of any. That's a really good question, yeah. If one is trying to counter the other, so to speak, it's not apparent to us. Good question. All right, I'm going to keep going. There'll be more Doris later, I promise. But thanks for that. So those are some of my questions, right? What was the story trying to promote? How has the story been used? We might ask the question, too, like, why conquest? Like, what is it about that idea that might have been appealing or might have seemed justified to some folks? And so we'll come to that in just a minute. 2 years ago, I used this exact same slide. I know you remember it. This comes from an article. Robert Allen Warrior is a Native American Old Testament scholar who has a lovely article called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians. And as you can guess, he's drawing connections between the conquest story in Joshua with the general Native American experience in this country. And he's got three bits of advice for us as readers of these texts. And one of them is to keep the Canaanite experience at the center of our moral reflection and advocacy. In other words, we should read the book of Joshua and think, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. Jesus tells us to look out for those who are disempowered, right? There's a way in which we should read these texts and always be aware of the ways in which history is filled with people who are survivors and victims, and we have a particular calling, and that's good advice. Number two, he says the church should explore how Joshua's conquest story has influenced American consciousness and ideology. That's a large part of what I'm going to be doing from this point forward. And then three, he also says, consider what's lost if Joshua's conquest story erases an actual history of indigenous struggle in preference of a myth about invasion. In other words, if the real story out there is what we know as ancient Israelite religion emerged out of a somewhat multicultural, kind of tribal environment in what we call the Holy Land, what does that mean? What would that ancient real story, that real history teach us? And what does it mean that we choose, or whoever compiled the Bible or whoever wrote Joshua chose to pave over that with a story about conquest? Right? What if we took a story about struggle and about survival and about winners and losers and just turned it into a simplistic story, right, of the good guys and the bad guys? I want to look a bit at number three as well. But I want to take Warrior's advice here seriously, especially around number two. And one of the ways into that is to ask the question, what are the reasons that some of the Older Testament books give for the commands to extinguish the Canaanites? In other words, what do they say? What is it about the Canaanites that was so terrible? Is it just simply they have the land that we want? Or was there more to it? And the answer is there was more to it. Again, this is oversimplifying it, but there are a number of places where the Bible voices concern about the Canaanites, the original inhabitants of that land. Deuteronomy 7. I'm skipping around here. You can see the ellipses, but I'm trying to keep it short. You must utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me, this is God speaking, to serve other gods. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire. Not too subtle, right? You get a sense of the perceived threat here. The book of Exodus, speaking about the Canaanites, they shall not live in your land, lest they make you sin against me. Again, this is God speaking. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Deuteronomy again. You must not let anything that breathes remain alive. Indeed, you shall annihilate them, so that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and thus you sin against the Lord your God. What's the stated purpose here? They're going to lead you astray, right? If you let them survive, even as this oppressed minority in the land, it's going to be bad news for your descendants. They're going to lead you astray. You see a deep concern here about forsaking God for other religions. You see a deep concern about the corrupting influence of folks. If I had more time, I would talk about ways we see similar statements in the American westward expansion as well. The article I mentioned at the beginning by Daniel Hawk quotes some American thinkers who say alarmingly similar things about indigenous Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this is interesting, right? Here's the worry. The worry isn't so much, well, this land is our land, it's not their land, or something like that. But it's this idea that you're going to choose idolatry, right, if you don't purify the land here. And again, that's one of the big concerns when the nation is later on in exile. Again, now we're jumping ahead 500, 700 years, right? And the concern is what caused us to sin. Some people are blaming the presence of other religions in the land. Some people are blaming intermarriage with other tribes, other people. Some people are blaming the way in which idolatry is never stamped out. Some people are blaming bad kings, right? Who's to blame? Well, everybody. What happens when there's a crisis, when the whole system falls apart, a nation falls apart? Everybody starts blaming somebody else, right? And blaming somebody in the history. And one of the fingers is being pointed at, right? The Canaanites were a corrupting influence. We should have gotten rid of them entirely. Perhaps that. So you see that in Scripture. What do we do with scriptures like this? I don't think we cut them out and tear them out, right? We look at these and we remember the ways in which we sometimes are used to we sometimes use God to scapegoat others, right? There are ways in which these are stark reminders. The religious people sometimes put blame in that way for all sorts of events in the world. So there's Joshua still standing there, right, as this book that, again, says similar things. The quotes from Joshua are too long to put on a slide, right, but it says similar things about the need to annihilate everybody. And you're probably wondering, well, how influential has the book of Joshua been? My short answer before you ask the question is I don't know. I can't give you like a source map, that has who quoted Joshua when and where, and how did Joshua explicitly, at least, filter its way down into all sorts of things. If you're to ask me, for example, does the Netanyahu government quote from the book of Joshua frequently right now? I simply don't know, right? I don't know much about the Netanyahu government. I know some of the religious groups that keep Netanyahu in power, and some of them are very interested in the Joshua narrative. We can talk about that if you want. Again, there's various ways of being Jewish. There are various Jewish views on the land. When it comes to the American experience, again, I don't know if people are quoting Joshua frequently or not. But I do think, clearly, Christianity has co-opted this notion that we see in Joshua of being a people who somehow is specially chosen to take what it wants to take and to subject others to what they want to subject them to. Why? For a similar purpose, right? We don't want to be influenced by their religions. We want to be influenced by, quote unquote, their sins. Do you see what I mean? That kind of us, them, that kind of weird, deep, deep fear of the presence of an other. Hawk, in his article, talks about the difference between if you let people survive as a minority, as an oppressed minority, versus exterminating them entirely, when you exterminate them entirely, you can create a myth of your homeland, right? He sees that taking place in Joshua. He sees that in his reading of some American history as well. Like I said, these are hard topics. It makes me think about, what are the stories that we tell? I'm going to put "we" there in quotes. Who are we talking about? What are the stories we tell that empower us to survive amidst adversity, right? What are the stories we tell about our own past? That adversity could be in your family, it could be in your neighborhood, could be in your nation, could be in your congregation, right? We all have the stories, the themes, the convictions we fall back on when times are difficult to encourage us to move forward. Maybe those are stories about God's faithfulness. Maybe those are stories about heroes in our past. Sometimes those stories are deeply violent. Sometimes those stories have villainized people. What stories do we tell ourselves to cover up our own shortcomings, right? So we don't have to face the reality of who we are or what our past looks like or who we've injured. What stories do we tell to correct ourselves, right? What are the stories we turn to when we want to repent or repair or find new ways forward? The Bible, as we've noted, is full of stories. Margaret and I, the last 4 or 5 weeks, have quoted from a lot of stories. I like that the Bible is so full of narrative, because narrative doesn't yield simplistic answers, right? Narrative forces you to ask the question, what's this story about? What are the convictions of this story? Who told this story? How am I supposed to respond to this story? Some of the Bible's stories are covering up shortcomings. Some of the Bible's stories help us correct ourselves. Sometimes the Bible empowers us too. I promised to try to draw some threads into the American experience, and I'm going to start to wrap up here so we can talk. Is anybody familiar with the doctrine of discovery? When I use that term, people know what I'm talking about. A couple of you. Good. So I'm going to teach you. The doctrine of discovery is the name given to a worldview, a mindset, to some theological convictions that arose from a number of papal decrees from the 15th century. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Surprise, surprise, from around 1450 to around 1500, a number of papal decrees were issued to support the Western European colonial movement at the time. I should note that the Catholic Church, this is all prior to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church revoked these decrees within about 50 years after giving them, but by that time the damage was essentially done, right? It had already kind of unleashed some of the worst of Western European colonialism. What do these decrees do? They authorize Western European nations to subjugate non-Christian people, to seize their land and take their resources. The first one was from 1450. I forgot the name of the Pope, but it was directly given. It was a decree given to the King of Portugal, saying you are welcome to go to any non-Christian land, subjugate them, make them Christian by any means necessary, do what you have to do, take their land, take their resources, whatever it requires, right? I mean, shocking things. But so now the King of Portugal has basically a religious, right, or a theological warrant to do what he does. Not just Portugal, other lands have these as well. Some of these decrees gave permission to enslave, essentially treating those that they would enslave as not fully human, right? Savages in need of being reformed. Language of unbelievers and infidels. The ostensible purpose here, right? Do this so you may convert them. Right? We see this in this nation as well, or in this continent as well, right? You're familiar with the boarding schools in both Canada and the United States, right? How do you kill the Indian to save the soul is in some ways a slogan of that, right? How do you choke out culture so that ostensibly you might raise up converts? You might think, why care about the doctrine of discovery? That was a long time ago. It looks like it was rescinded by the Vatican itself. Principles from this general doctrine found their way into Western and international law. I'm not a lawyer, I can't speak to this, but there are several Supreme Court cases largely around land issues with Native Americans and the U.S. government that would refer to aspects of this, again, this doctrine that kind of wormed its way into a lot of Western land law. I believe the most recent time it was cited was something like 1970 or 1960 in an American court. not the doctrine of discovery, but these kinds of ancient European, or, I'm sorry, not ancient, these kinds of colonial European laws that found their way into American legal practice. How do you root those out, right? How do you worm those out? Churches and have been trying to play a part in this as well lately, or maybe not as timely as we could have. You're wondering, the PCUSA repudiated kind of the theology behind this so-called doctrine in 2016. In 2018, issued a report. That's what Presbyterians are really good at. Reports. We rock at reports. But this is actually a pretty good report, right? It includes recommendations for congregations to think about ways in which they might work toward repair on behalf of indigenous communities. If you're wondering about the church, poor Pope Francis is sitting all alone here in the midst of a protest. Francis formally repudiated this doctrine in 2023 before his death. So again, churches are slow on this, largely responding to pressure, to justified pressure from indigenous communities in the United States and in Canada, who have noted the ways in which this continues to be part of the ideologies that dehumanize as well. So that's one example, right? How has this kind of Joshua idea of Christian power being able to do whatever it wants to do persisted, right, beyond the writing of the book of Joshua? You might know this this painting, American Progress, 1872, right, celebrating the period of manifest destiny in the United States. Everybody moving, all the movement in this is from east to west, right, from right to left. There's Columbia, who's, I would have dressed differently for an event like this. Stringing telegraph wire as she walks from east to west. You see the railroad being there. You see the trains there. Of course, in the lower left, you see what? You see Native Americans being driven further west, being driven out. You even see animals. I think there's a bear in the front being pushed out. This idea of taming the land and having a divine sanction for doing so. I think this still hangs in the U.S. Capitol. I'm not sure if it's still there or not, but I know it did at one time. Westward the course of empire takes its way, 1861. This one a little less violent, but certainly this idea of westward expansion, this idea of walking into a new land. Language of promised land is sometimes used. That's not really a biblical phrase, but we hear that sometimes used in the way in which Americans talked about their westward movement. I don't want to blame Joshua for all of Western colonialism, but it was, right, some of the theology that's in there did find its way into ways in which the church endorsed the political and economic and just kind of cruel intentions of some of our worst aspects of colonialism. You probably want to talk now. I know what happens. I know when we break you into small groups, you kind of talk about whatever you want to talk about at your tables, which is fine. I'm just glad you're talking. But if I can make some suggestions, here are 3 questions that we might think about. The Bible includes numerous promises about God's commitment to provide, protect, and sustain. Those are good promises. I believe those promises. The question is, for whom, right? And how are they realized? How do we live in light of those promises, knowing at the same time we have an all-too-human inclination toward dominating others, especially people whom we might label as different or as rivals? You might think, well, I don't have that inclination. Well, I do, so help me, okay? How do we, our history shows that. 2, how do these topics sit with you? How do they touch on your own perspectives and experiences? Right? These new to you, are these abhorrent to you? Do you have your own personal histories to tell? Families came to this country for a whole host of reasons, right? I want to acknowledge that and respect that. And some families didn't come to this country, but have been here for a very, very long time. 3rd question, what does it mean to live faithfully in response to the biblical themes we've discussed, or really that I've thrown at you, and in response to ways those themes have been used through history? What does it mean to live faithfully both to the themes that we've looked at, but also what does it mean to live faithfully now, knowing how those themes have been used and misused throughout history? I wanted to leave a good amount of time, so I'm going to call you back in like 12 minutes. You can discuss these at your tables. You're like, 12 minutes is not enough time, I realize, but there you go. Hopefully I've at least equipped you to talk about these in meaningful ways. If you have questions, if you need me at your table, just yell Mark or wave your hand, and I'm happy to come if I can answer anything. But I want to give you some chance to discuss this. I'm going to call us back in just a minute. We're nearly out of time. The live stream's either about to cut off or already has cut off. But I'm curious about question 3 in particular. What does faithful living look like with some of these themes? Not all the themes I mentioned today were horrible, but and ways that these themes have been used or misused in history. Any input from your discussion? Doris is eager to run the room. All right, you can answer any question. That Ken in the back. Good. I like that Doris has got to work for it.
I just shared at our table just at the very end that I see this pattern that we're seeing here throughout all of history. Nation after nation conquers nation after nation. And that I'm here in church with all of you and others because I think this is predominantly a personal journey, and that I have a lot of this stuff in me, and I hope that over my years I will move from a more self-protected place to a place of humility, love, and eventually, if possible, sacrificial love. Kind of that thing that, to be honest, I see it in mothers. That's the one place that I really see it.
Yeah.
And I think if a lot of us got there, then these bigger political things could evolve.
Thank you.
You know, all the Old Testament makes me really mad, which we talked about. But every time I get to a point, and I think I feel things way too deeply, but I get so frustrated at times. And the only thing that seems to help, and I've heard it time and time again from people on, different things that I listen to, is that the only thing we can do at a time like this is to love more, is to be kinder, is to spread that, and not go the opposite direction. Go into the New Testament, is what we were talking about. Yeah, right. Because how else do we fight it? You can't.
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, that's all I got.
We will get to the way of Jesus. Trust me, which is what that means. I hear that in both of these comments. I think of time for one more, perhaps.
I'll say something.
Yeah, please, Doris.
At our table, we talked really practically because Indigenous Peoples Day, but we have a leader of our country who wants to reclaim Columbus, so I thought we should show solidarity with honoring the people who are here.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's just a practical
Thank
thing.
you. Well, that gets to number 3, right? I mean, so what does this mean? Part of this means how do we work towards repairing the past? How do we recognize what this means about Scripture, and what texts do we go to, and how do we... Paul will talk about living with a renewing of your mind, right? How do you purge your mind of biases, ideologies, things that have done real harm, and find those new ones, right? Navigating the Bible requires us to keep reading the parts in light of the whole. And that's one of these key principles. Right? I was not joking when I said don't build your whole theology on just Joshua and Judges, right? What's the larger whole? And some of the comments have, I think, connected to that, right? How do we do that? Not every page in the Bible is going to have a blessing for you if you just flip to it randomly and point at it. You might read something about wiping out the Amalekites, and so the question is, what's that kind of story? What's that kind of statement supposed to do for us? What's it supposed to guide us toward? How are we supposed to think about this? Where might God be in the midst of this? Robert Allen Warrior said, when you hear about the Amalekites, you should think maybe that's where you're going to find Jesus, right, among there, as opposed to the other parts of the story. Next week, we're going to talk about welcoming the stranger, which also, strangely enough, has connections to the news. That's part of it, but also talk about ways in which the Bible doesn't just talk about the importance of tending to migrants and refugees, but we'll talk about God, the way in which the Bible characterizes God as a migrant God as well. And I look forward to that next Sunday. So I hope to see you here.